Imagine yourself standing in the middle of a vast museum. Marble statues gleam under the dim light, and paintings depict a woman with piercing eyes, crimson lips, draped in garments of unmatched splendor. Everything you see conjures a familiar image. Cleopatra, the most seductive woman in history, the Egyptian queen who, we were told, used her beauty to ensnare the most powerful men of Rome. That is the story we have heard, read in books and witnessed on the silver screen. But what if I told you it was all a fabrication? That this legendary image of Cleopatra was never the truth, but a calculated smear campaign written by her enemies. Cleopatra, the last woman to sit on the pharaoh's throne, was never just a beauty. She was a strategist, a master diplomat, a woman who dared to stand against the raging tide of history called Rome. She was not the victim of passion, she was the victim of the pen. Pens held by Roman historians, poets and emperors, men who transformed her into a symbol of lust rather than intellect. To understand this distortion, we must travel back to a moment when Rome itself was tearing apart. In the power struggle between Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, and Mark Antony, Cleopatra became the perfect excuse for Rome to unify. Octavian needed a common enemy, a monster to parade before the public, and he found it in Cleopatra. In his speeches, Cleopatra was no longer the sovereign ruler of Egypt. She was the Eastern witch, the temptress who enslaved Rome's greatest men in her bed. In doing so, Octavian not only slandered Cleopatra, but also reframed his personal conflict with Antony into a holy war for Roman virtue. This was no longer a feud between generals, it was Rome against the corruption of Egypt. And so the world remembered Cleopatra only through that warped lens. In poetry, she appeared as a goddess of love, seducing Caesar and Antony with her body. In European art centuries later, she was painted with pale skin, red lips, bare chest, a snake coiled in her hand, the eternal image of her tragic death. In Hollywood, Cleopatra remained imprisoned in the frame of deadly beauty, with Elizabeth Taylor dazzling in golden robes, eyes lined with mystery and allure. Yet the real Cleopatra was nothing like this. She was not renowned for her looks. Even the rare surviving Roman accounts admit Cleopatra was not the most beautiful woman of her age. What made her captivating was not her face or skin, but her mind. Cleopatra mastered 9 languages, delved into mathematics, philosophy, medicine, astronomy. She could read Aristotle, debate politics with scholars, and authored scientific works herself. The Egyptians respected her not because of beauty, but because she ruled them, understood them, and spoke their tongue. So why was this truth buried? The answer lies in Rome's control over memory. When Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, he held not only political power but the power of storytelling. He permitted poets like Virgil, Horace, and Propertius to glorify Rome's triumph, and within their verses, Cleopatra was cast as a hysterical woman crazed by lust. These words became the foundation, repeated and copied for centuries across Europe. The tragedy is that this smear campaign hid a far more dangerous truth. Cleopatra was never weak. She was a genuine threat. She had transformed Egypt into a state strong enough to rival Rome, forged a political and military alliance with Antony, and nearly tipped the balance of power across the Mediterranean. A woman daring to challenge the mightiest empire in the world, that was something Rome could not tolerate. And so they had to kill her twice, once with swords and once with words. Cleopatra had to be remembered as a seductress, never as a strategist. For if the truth emerged, Rome's glorious victory would no longer appear as the triumph of morality, but as the political assassination of a woman too intelligent, too dangerous to be allowed to live. Thus, for centuries, when people spoke of Cleopatra, they thought of coal-lined eyes, whispered seductions, and the venom of a serpent. Few remembered Cleopatra of the battlefield, Cleopatra of the council chamber, Cleopatra of the great library of Alexandria. But history cannot conceal forever. Modern scholarship is peeling away Rome's propaganda. Historians are reconstructing Cleopatra not as the temptress, but as the survivor, the woman who wielded her intellect against an empire. And when we look closely, we realize something ironic. Rome's very slander proves her strength. For they could not defeat her with swords alone, they had to destroy her memory. So when we speak of Cleopatra today, the important question is not whether she was beautiful. The important truth is that she lived, she fought, she ruled, and she made the most powerful men of Rome tremble. Her distorted image is a bitter lesson. History is not only written in blood and stone, but also in words. And whoever controls the story decides who is hero, who is villain. And beneath the dust of 2,000 years of propaganda, a voice still whispers, Cleopatra was not undone by beauty, she was undone by the pen. But even that pen has failed, because today, as the truth resurfaces, Cleopatra rises again, not as a seductress, but as a true queen. In 69 BCE, in the radiant city of Alexandria, the jewel of the Mediterranean, a baby girl cried her first breath inside the Ptolemaic palace. No one could have imagined that this child would become the final emblem of ancient Egypt and the woman who would make even Rome shudder. Her name was Cleopatra. Cleopatra was not a pharaoh in the traditional sense. She did not carry purely Egyptian blood, but belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, descendants of Greek generals left behind by Alexander the Great after his conquest of Egypt. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemies ruled as outsiders. They sat on the pharaoh's throne but spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and looked at native Egyptians as strangers. But Cleopatra was different. From an early age, she realized something vital. To truly rule Egypt, one could not remain hidden behind palace walls, gazing down at the people through veils of silk. One had to understand them, speak their language, share their faith. And that is precisely what Cleopatra did. While her ancestors kept their distance, Cleopatra chose to learn Egyptian, the tongue of peasants, priests, and builders along the Nile. It seemed a small act, yet it carried immense political weight. She ceased to be just a foreign queen and became a pharaoh in the eyes of her people. The world around Cleopatra was collapsing. Egypt, once the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, was drowning in crisis. Floods grew erratic, famine spread, the treasury emptied, while the royal court rotted with incestuous marriages and endless intrigue. To the west, Rome loomed like a gathering storm, swallowing territories one by one. For a young queen, the throne of Egypt was no reward. It was a burden heavier than gold. At 18 years old, Cleopatra officially stepped into the deadly game of power. But the throne was not hers alone. By Ptolemaic tradition, Cleopatra was forced to marry and co-rule with her younger brother, Ptolemy III, just a boy of 10. In name, they were husband and wife. In reality, it was an unforgiving war between a child manipulated by court ministers and an ambitious young woman who already understood that survival meant seizing absolute power. In this dangerous arena, Cleopatra did not rely on beauty to fight. She knew beauty could attract for a moment, but could never secure a throne. What she wielded instead was intellect, the ability to read people, and a resolve as sharp as any general's blade. Cleopatra began to build a network of support. She won over scholars, far-sighted officials, and, most crucially, she sought to strengthen her bond with the common people, those who still believed in the pharaoh as the living representative of the gods on earth. Inside the golden-carved halls of Alexandria's palace, a silent war raged. Ptolemy's advisors ceaselessly slandered Cleopatra, conspiring to drive her out. But Cleopatra did not respond with daggers or poison, as so many in the court would have done. She answered with patience, with strategy. She observed, she waited, she calculated every step, not just to survive, but to reinforce her image as the true queen of Egypt. Meanwhile, Rome's ambitions grew harder to disguise. Roman envoys appeared more frequently in Alexandria, bringing demands for debts, tributes, and casting their sharp measuring gazes upon the kingdom. Cleopatra realized that to keep her throne, she could not merely win palace intrigues. She would have to learn the political game of Rome's wolves. She began studying Roman law, customs, and above all, the art of diplomacy, something few in her dynasty had ever bothered to master. It was during this crucible that Cleopatra forged her greatest weapon, the ability to use intellect as a sword, to turn language into a blade, and to earn the respect, even fear, of those who opposed her. By the time she entered her 20s, Cleopatra was no longer a forgotten princess, but a strategist in silk, a ruler sharpening her mind in the shadows. But the Egyptian throne was no game of patience. One day it turned into open battlefield. Ptolemy III and his counselors moved decisively to strip Cleopatra of power, forcing her into exile from the palace. Yet even as she was driven into the darkness, Cleopatra did not call it defeat. She saw it as opportunity, an opening to rebuild her strength, to prepare for a strike that would shock both her own court and Rome itself. For Cleopatra understood one truth: power is never given, it must be taken. And to take it, she was willing to do what her Greek ancestors never dared, to merge herself with the Egyptian people, to speak their tongue, to worship their gods, to transform herself into the living embodiment of Egypt, still breathing under the looming shadow of Rome. At 18, Cleopatra was not merely stepping onto the throne. She was entering a game of life and death, where her opponent was not only her young brother, but the most powerful empire in the ancient world. And in that game, her weapon was not beauty, it was her mind. A mind that Rome would soon discover was more dangerous than any army. Cleopatra, the young queen of Egypt, lost everything once. Cast out by her brother Ptolemy III and his ministers, she became a fugitive in her own kingdom. Alexandria, the glittering city by the sea, now lay in the hands of those who sought to erase her. Yet Cleopatra did not collapse. In the shadows, she waited for an opportunity, one that would either restore her throne or bury her name forever. That opportunity had a name: Julius Caesar. In 48 BCE, Rome convulsed in civil war. Caesar, the indomitable general who had just crushed Pompey, pursued his rival all the way to Egypt. Alexandria became the stage for a confrontation between the greatest powers of the age. For Cleopatra, Caesar's arrival was not just an event, it was destiny. She knew that if she could win the trust of this formidable Roman, she could turn the board upside down. And so one of the most legendary acts in history was born. It is said Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence, wrapped inside a great carpet, or perhaps a linen sack, carried past guards in the dead of night. When the carpet was unrolled before the Roman general, Cleopatra emerged, not as a supplicant but as a queen in her own right, eyes sharp as blades, posture regal, pride unshaken. This was no act of seduction. It was a declaration. Cleopatra was sending a message. She was not a deposed princess, but the rightful heir to Egypt's throne. And she chose Caesar to witness that claim. Julius Caesar, pragmatic and accustomed to power, instantly recognized what was extraordinary about Cleopatra. He saw not just a woman, but a political partner. Cleopatra did not rely on flirtation or coy glances. She spoke the language of rulers: confidence, intelligence, and the courage to look directly into the heart of power. Their alliance was soon tested in fire. Egypt plunged into civil war between Cleopatra and Ptolemy III. Caesar chose her side. The streets of Alexandria turned into battlegrounds. Roman legions and Cleopatra's forces clashed violently with Ptolemy's army. At last, Ptolemy III was defeated, fleeing only to drown in the Nile. Cleopatra reclaimed her throne, not through beauty, but through audacious strategy. Yet the outcome of this alliance reached beyond politics. Caesar and Cleopatra became lovers. But even in love, Cleopatra never yielded her power. When she bore him a son, Caesarion, she placed the entire Roman world into a crisis. That child carried both Roman and Egyptian blood, a living symbol of a future that could shift the balance of global power. For Rome, Caesarion was a threat. Caesar had already unsettled the Senate with his ambition. Now, with an illegitimate child by a foreign queen, he posed an even greater danger. This was not just scandal. It was a challenge, a declaration that Rome's destiny might one day belong to a dynasty half Egyptian. But Cleopatra did not flinch. On the contrary, she turned the child into a banner of legitimacy, a symbol of her power. She did not travel to Rome as a secret mistress. She arrived as a queen adorned in silk and gold, appearing openly beside Caesar. It was an act unprecedented in history. Picture the scene: Rome, the center of the world, where women were expected to remain shadows behind men, now witnessed an Egyptian monarch standing proudly next to Caesar, every inch his equal. The Senate trembled. To many, Cleopatra was no longer a mistress from the East. She was a political nightmare, a queen bold enough to unsettle the very foundation of the Republic. And that was the greatest proof of Cleopatra's genius. With one carefully staged performance, the scene of emerging from the carpet, she transformed a meeting into a historical turning point. With her intellect and her resolve, she not only regained the throne she had lost, but placed Egypt at the very center of Mediterranean politics. Though centuries have passed, the tale of Cleopatra and Caesar is still told as a legendary romance. Yet behind the veil of passion lies a cold truth. It was a political gamble. Cleopatra wagered her crown and her life on a single move, and she won. But as with all wagers, the price eventually came. The alliance with Caesar and the birth of Caesarion placed Cleopatra into the spiral of Rome's enmity. What she gained from that meeting was not only power but also a scar upon history, a threat Rome would never forget. March 15th, 44 BCE. On the marble steps of the Roman Senate, history changed course with cold, calculated blades. Julius Caesar, the general who had conquered half the known world, the man who had shaken the Republic to its core, fell beneath the knives of his own friends, allies, and senators. His blood stained the stone floor, and Rome shuddered. In that moment of upheaval, one woman stood silently at the margins, unsurprised but shaken: Cleopatra. She had known this day might come. For a woman who could read men's hearts as she did, it was not difficult to see that Caesar's boundless power was also his death sentence. But knowing did not lessen the blow. She lost not only an ally, a lover, the father of her son. She lost the shield that had protected Egypt against Rome's ambitions. As Rome collapsed into chaos, Cleopatra did not foolishly remain. She withdrew, carrying Caesarion, her son by Caesar, back to Alexandria. But this return was not the same as before. She no longer came as the woman who once stepped from a carpet in daring spectacle. She came as a warrior, as a pharaoh reborn in Egypt's waning age. From loss, Cleopatra began to remake herself. She understood that if she allowed herself to remain merely Caesar's former mistress, she would quickly fade from Rome's theater of tragedy. But if she became pharaoh, not in name only but in reality, she could turn grief into strength. And so Cleopatra donned a new identity. She appeared before her people not as a widow, but as the living embodiment of Isis, the mother goddess, protector of Egypt. She wore the double crown, symbol of Upper and Lower Egypt, reminding all that she was queen of the whole land, undivided. Statues, rituals, and ceremonies reinforced this image, Cleopatra as the legitimate pharaoh. Yet Cleopatra did not stop at symbols. She needed to secure Egypt's future, and that required more than herself. Thus she made a bold decision. She elevated Caesarion, still only a child, to co-ruler. This was not merely a domestic gesture, it was a direct message to Rome. Caesar's son lives, and he reigns in Egypt. Caesarion was not only Cleopatra's blood, he was also Rome's. In him, Cleopatra held her ultimate card, a child who could become either a symbol of unity or a threat to Rome's stability. Rome, of course, was not blind. Roman statesmen looked at Caesarion as a dangerous shadow. If the boy grew, if he gathered support, he could challenge the inheritance of Octavian, Caesar's adopted son. And that is why Cleopatra became Rome's sworn enemy in Octavian's eyes. But Cleopatra did not tremble. She understood the rules of the game, and she was prepared to play to the end. In Alexandria, she rebuilt her country. Under her reign, Egypt entered a rare period of stability. She strengthened commerce, expanded diplomatic ties, and tightly controlled the grain supply, the economic weapon upon which the Mediterranean depended. With the Nile, she not only fed her people, but held leverage in negotiations with Rome itself. Cleopatra was no longer a queen sheltered by the favor of a Roman general. She was a pharaoh in her own right, a sovereign ruler with independent power, even as Rome's shadow spread across every wave of the sea. In the years after Caesar's death, Cleopatra proved she needed no man to define her. Loss had made her stronger, sharper. She learned to wield grief like a shield, turning her image into a living legend. To her people, Cleopatra was more than a queen. She was proof that Egypt had not yet bowed to Rome. And yet, Cleopatra knew each day that passed brought Rome closer. Octavian and Mark Antony, two rising pillars of Roman power, were reshaping the world. On this chessboard, Cleopatra and her son were both a minor piece and a dangerous one. Still, Cleopatra was never a spectator. She swore that as long as her blood and Caesarion's blood ran through their veins, Egypt would not bow to Rome. That was not only the oath of a queen. It was the vow of Egypt's last pharaoh, a woman reborn from the shadows of an assassination, transformed into the indomitable symbol of a dying kingdom's defiance. And from that determination, Cleopatra stepped into the next chapter, a chapter of fire, of sea, of love and betrayal, when she would face Mark Antony, and with him, challenge the very destiny of Rome. After Caesar's death, Rome fell into a vacuum of power. Two names emerged, bound by a fragile but fateful alliance: Octavian, Caesar's legal heir, and Mark Antony, the renowned general, the Lion of Rome. And in this struggle, Cleopatra was no mere bystander. She was a strategic piece. Antony, with the instincts of a warrior, quickly realized that if he wished to balance Octavian, he needed Egypt, and he needed Cleopatra. And so the summons was sent to Alexandria. But Cleopatra was not the kind of woman to answer as a submissive subject. She recognized this as an opportunity to once again assert herself on the world stage. She prepared for an entrance that the world would remember for millennia. It is said Cleopatra sailed to the meeting on a great gilded barge, its purple sails billowing like a divine aura. On deck, incense drifted, Egyptian music echoed, and Cleopatra appeared like a living goddess, an incarnation of Aphrodite upon the Cydnus River. She did not come merely to meet Mark Antony. She came to conquer him with a weapon greater than soldiers, legend. Antony, accustomed to seeing women as shadows behind politicians, was struck still. Before him was not Caesar's widow, but a regal queen who knew exactly what she wanted and how to take it. From that moment on, Cleopatra and Antony became a couple bound not only by love, but by strategy. Between them burned a fusion of passion and politics, of ambition for power and personal devotion. Cleopatra saw in Antony a chance to protect Egypt from Rome's claws. Antony saw in Cleopatra a fountain of gold, grain, and legitimacy to sustain his own ambitions. Together, they built an alliance that shook the Mediterranean to its core. In Antony's embrace, Cleopatra was never the Eastern mistress Rome mocked. She was an equal ally. When Antony made military decisions, Cleopatra sat in the councils. When Antony prepared campaigns, Cleopatra supplied food, ships, and treasure to sustain the armies. She was not confined to the shadows of the stage. She stepped into the light, shared authority, appeared in decrees, and co-ruled beside him. The result of this alliance was not only successful campaigns, but also a family. Cleopatra and Antony had 3 children: Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. But this was no romantic household. Their family was a living emblem of empire in the making, proof of the merging of Egypt and Rome, a blending that posed a direct threat to Octavian's supremacy. Together, Cleopatra and Antony ruled more than Egypt. Their influence spread outward. Territories in Syria, Cyprus, and Greece came under their control. No longer was Cleopatra a lone queen resisting Rome. She and Antony had become a power couple, bold enough to challenge Rome on its own stage. And if one looks closely, one sees Cleopatra as the soul of this alliance. She brought not only gold and ships, she brought vision. In Antony's eyes, Cleopatra was the partner who allowed him to dream of a new kingdom, a radiant Eastern Rome, where they ruled together as near divinities. In the eyes of their enemies, she was the instigator, the woman who led Antony astray, guiding him into treason against Rome. But for Cleopatra, it was all calculation. Every banquet, every lavish display, every dazzling appearance had purpose. She knew Rome would never allow Egypt to exist in peace. Therefore, she needed to create a force strong enough to make Rome hesitate. Antony was the perfect piece of the puzzle. Perhaps it was this partnership that so terrified Octavian. Not the love, not the kisses stolen in the night, but the reality that Cleopatra had transformed Antony, one of Rome's most powerful generals, into her equal partner, and through him was building a new empire at Rome's doorstep. The alliance of Cleopatra and Antony was not merely a romance, it was a challenge, a declaration of silent war. And as they built a family together, ruled side by side, and shared a vision of empire, Octavian realized, to hold Rome completely, he would have to destroy Cleopatra. But before that destruction, Cleopatra and Antony left behind an image that burned bright. Two people daring to love and to dream, daring to wager their thrones and their fates against the unstoppable tide of Rome's rise. 34 BCE. Alexandria gleamed in splendor. In the great square before the eyes of thousands of citizens and foreign envoys, Mark Antony, the legendary general of Rome, stood beside Cleopatra. In the opulent ceremony later known as the Donations of Alexandria, he proclaimed Cleopatra Queen of Kings and bestowed royal titles upon her children. Caesarion, the son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, was crowned King of Kings. The other children she bore Antony received territories, Syria, Cyprus, and parts of Rome's lands. This was not just a ceremony, it was a manifesto. Antony and Cleopatra were founding a new empire, a counterweight to Rome, before the entire world. And in Rome, Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and rightful heir, erupted in fury. For Octavian, Antony's actions were betrayal. But what enraged him most was not Antony, it was Cleopatra. In his eyes, she was not simply an Egyptian queen. She was the Eastern witch who had bewitched Antony, reduced a great Roman general into a puppet in her hands. Octavian understood one thing. To bring down Antony, he needed to strip Cleopatra of her legitimacy. And so began one of the greatest propaganda campaigns in history. In Rome, pamphlets, speeches, and venomous tales spread everywhere. Cleopatra, they said, was a debauched woman who made Antony forget his Roman roots. They painted her as an Eastern sorceress, corrupting Roman souls with beauty and magic. And above all, they magnified the Donations of Alexandria as proof that Antony had betrayed Rome, willing to hand Caesar's legacy to a foreign child, Caesarion. The brutal truth was this. Octavian struck Cleopatra not only with swords but with words. He turned her into a symbol of corruption, convincing the Senate and the people that Rome's true enemy was not Antony, it was Cleopatra. The results were astonishing. Instead of declaring war on a Roman citizen, the Senate declared war on Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. In doing so, Antony was not branded a traitor, but a victim manipulated by Cleopatra. It was a masterstroke of Octavian's strategy. He legitimized war while making Cleopatra Rome's ultimate demon. But Cleopatra was not easily subdued. She understood this campaign of slander was aimed not only at her reputation, but at her very power. And so she prepared for the worst: war. In Alexandria's palace, Cleopatra met with Antony and his generals. A grand fleet was raised, more than 500 ships ready to sail. Egypt's treasury was open to fund the war. Gold flowed to hire mercenaries, resources poured into preparation for the coming clash. Cleopatra was not merely the financier, she sat at the table, shaping strategy. She knew that if they failed, Egypt would cease to be a kingdom. It would become just another Roman province. In Cleopatra's eyes, this was not just a battle for her throne. It was a battle for the soul of a civilization more than 3,000 years old. And she, the last pharaoh, would not allow Rome to write Egypt's final chapter. Far away, Octavian also prepared. He had not only disciplined soldiers, but the support of Roman opinion, something Cleopatra would never have. In the minds of the Roman people, Cleopatra was not a queen. She was an enemy who had to be destroyed. The confrontation was set, not Rome against Egypt, but Octavian against Cleopatra. A battle between propaganda and reality, between pen and sword, between a future emperor and the last pharaoh. In Alexandria, gazing toward the horizon, Cleopatra must have known this war would decide not only her fate and Antony's, but the fate of Egypt itself. Yet she did not tremble. She had faced Caesar, had risen again after his death, had built an alliance strong enough to challenge Rome. And now, before Octavian, she was ready to enter one final gamble. A gamble fought with blood, with the sea, and with the honor of an ancient civilization. September 2nd, 31st BCE. On the dark blue waters off Actium, on Greece's western coast, the two greatest powers of the ancient world prepared to clash. On one side stood Mark Antony and Cleopatra, commanding a massive fleet of more than 500 ships, symbols of a dream for a new empire, where Egypt and Rome stood as equals. On the other side was Octavian, the man shaping himself into Rome's first emperor, his army smaller but disciplined, cunning and guided by superior strategy. The air before battle was as heavy as molten iron, the incense rising from Egyptian ships mixed with salt and the stench of fear. Legend says that on the flagship's deck, Cleopatra appeared in royal robes, eyes ablaze with fire, while Antony stood like a warrior prepared to die. This was no ordinary naval battle. It was the ultimate wager. Either they triumphed and forged a new empire, or all would collapse in a sea of blood. As the sun climbed high, the war horns blared. Oars beat the waves, sails swelled with wind, steel clashed with steel, flaming arrows streaked across the sky, striking ships and setting the waters alight like a floating forge. At first, Antony and Cleopatra's fleet held the advantage. Their ships were massive, heavily armed, seemingly unstoppable. But Octavian brought more than numbers. He brought tactics. His admiral, Agrippa, a naval genius, maneuvered his forces with precision, breaking apart Antony's bulky formation piece by piece. The giant war machine of Cleopatra's alliance began to falter. Then came the fateful moment. Amidst fire and screams, Cleopatra's purple sails suddenly turned away, breaking from the battle. Her royal ship withdrew, fading slowly beyond the horizon. Why remains a mystery? Some say Cleopatra panicked, unable to bear the carnage. Others believe she had struck a secret bargain with Octavian to preserve Egypt. Still others argue it was a calculated retreat. Whatever the truth, her withdrawal was a blade driven straight into the hearts of Antony's soldiers. Seeing Cleopatra's sails vanish, Antony crumbled in despair. He abandoned command, leapt into a small boat and followed her, leaving his men in chaos. Leaderless, the fleet disintegrated. From that moment, the outcome of Actium was sealed. Their mighty armada dissolved into wreckage scattered by the sea. Octavian won not only on the battlefield, but in the minds of men. Cleopatra and Antony fled back to Alexandria. The city that once glittered with gold now dimmed into twilight. The palaces still shone, but inside lay only fear and despair. Antony, the once invincible general, drowned himself in wine and shame. He wandered the halls like a shadow, haunted by defeat and the crumbling loyalty of his soldiers. Cleopatra, unlike her broken lover, kept her cold clarity. She knew Actium was not just defeat, it was a death sentence for Egypt. All she could do now was safeguard her legacy. She ordered all treasures, gold, jewels, and the precious scrolls of the great library, moved into a fortified mausoleum beside the palace. She prepared for the end. If Rome conquered, at least the enemy would never fully claim the soul of Egypt. Then one day a rumor spread through the palace. Cleopatra had taken her own life, sealing herself inside the mausoleum with her treasures. The whisper reached Antony. In despair, Antony believed the love of his life was gone. With nothing left to lose, he chose to follow her. Drawing his sword, he plunged it into his own belly. Blood poured across his armor as he collapsed, his servants crying in horror. But tragedy was not yet finished. Antony did not die immediately. He was carried to Cleopatra, who in truth was still alive, still planning. Antony gasped his final breaths in her arms, his eyes filled with love and regret. And there, within the collapsing grandeur of Alexandria's palace, Antony died, not as a general, but as a broken man. Cleopatra cradled his body, but shed no tears. Her grief hardened into steel. She knew that now she stood alone. Antony had fallen, but she still had to face Octavian, and within her eyes still burned a flame. If she must die, she would die as a pharaoh, not as a chained prisoner paraded through Rome. The Battle of Actium was not merely a military defeat. It was the prelude to the end of a civilization. It marked not only the death of a Roman general, but the approaching doom of ancient Egypt itself. And at the heart of this tragedy stood Cleopatra, both defeated and defiant, the only one still holding the power to decide how her final chapter would be written. Alexandria burned. After Actium, Octavian's army swept into Egypt like an unstoppable storm. The streets, once filled with music and commerce, now thundered with Roman hooves. Inside the palace, once radiant with gold and jewels, silence reigned. Mark Antony was dead, and Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, knew she now faced destiny alone. Octavian, fresh from victory, did not want Cleopatra's head. He wanted something far worse, to make her his trophy. In his triumph at Rome, he planned to shackle Cleopatra, drag her through crowded streets, and have her mocked like a captured beast. A queen who had once stood equal with Rome's generals, who had shaken the Mediterranean itself, would now be humiliated before thousands of jeering eyes. Cleopatra understood this perfectly. She knew that death in chains would not only destroy her body, but obliterate her memory. If Octavian brought her to Rome, she would no longer be remembered as Pharaoh, but as the conquered Eastern woman. History would not recall her as a queen, but as a spectacle of shame. And so Cleopatra resolved she would choose the moment of her end. In her final days, she locked herself inside the mausoleum she had built beside the palace. The walls gleamed with gold. Statues of Isis stood in silence, and Egypt's treasures rose in towering piles. She dressed in royal robes, placed the crown upon her head, and wore jewels that blazed like fire, not for a coronation, but for her death. Legend tells that Cleopatra prepared a basket of figs, within which was hidden a venomous serpent, the asp, symbol of Egypt. Others believe she used a sophisticated poison, stored away for years. But all accounts agree on one thing: Cleopatra did not allow anyone else to decide her death. Imagine that moment. In a silent chamber, torches flickering, golden light danced across her face. Cleopatra sat upright, her gaze unwavering. She was no longer the woman who once curled inside a carpet before Caesar, no longer the passionate lover of Antony. She was Pharaoh, the queen of the Nile, the living embodiment of Isis, and she would leave the world as a goddess. When Octavian's soldiers stormed in, they did not find a trembling captive. Instead, before them was a near mythic sight. Cleopatra lay motionless on a golden bed, her face serene as carved marble. At her side lay her two loyal handmaidens, who had chosen to follow her into death. In the chamber heavy with incense, Cleopatra was no longer mortal. She had become a symbol. Octavian entered, and instead of a living prize, he found only a corpse. No triumphant cheers, no grand spectacle. Cleopatra had stolen the performance Octavian had craved. With one final act, she had defeated him. That death, though tragic, was Cleopatra's ultimate assertion of power. She did not let history write her final chapter. She wrote it herself, with blood, with venom, with unbreakable will. After Cleopatra's death, Egypt officially became a Roman province. Octavian became Augustus, Rome's first emperor. The Egyptian civilization of more than 3,000 years came to its close. But Cleopatra, by choosing death in royal regalia, had preserved her image. She did not let Rome reduce her to a humiliated prisoner. She left the world with a question, a mystery, a legend. The world may debate how she died, by asp, by poison, by ritual or impulse, but no one can deny Cleopatra died as a queen, and that made her immortal. More than 2 millennia have passed, yet the image of Cleopatra in her final moment still chills humanity. Not because of her allure, but because of her pride. Not because of her beauty, but because of her will. She turned death into a weapon, defeat into immortality. For in choosing death over chains, Cleopatra sent a message across time. A queen may lose her throne, her army, her lover, but she will never lose her dignity. And that was Cleopatra's final victory. The victory of a woman who dared to choose her own fate. Cleopatra died, and with her ended a dynasty of more than 3,000 years. Alexandria sank into darkness, treasures seized, the people left staring into an uncertain future. But for Octavian, this was more than conquest. It was the birth of a new age. Octavian became Augustus, Rome's first emperor, and as his personal spoil, he turned Egypt into his own province, not shared with the Senate, not granted to any general. The land that had been the granary of the Mediterranean now became the storehouse that fed all of Rome. Gold, jewels, grain, all flowed directly into Augustus's coffers. But wealth was not the only thing he took from Cleopatra. What mattered more was the story. For Augustus understood, to cement his rule, he needed to transform his dead enemy into a symbol of decadence, to make Romans believe this war was not mere politics, but the triumph of morality over corruption. And so another campaign began, no longer fought with swords but with pen and imagination. In Roman records, Cleopatra was no longer the shrewd politician, no longer the ruler who spoke 9 languages, no longer the leader who guided Egypt through famine and civil strife. Instead, she was transformed into the depraved woman, the Eastern witch, the wanton temptress who led Antony astray. Poets such as Virgil, Horace, and Propertius wrote of her as the embodiment of lust and betrayal. That image slowly etched itself into the European imagination, Cleopatra as temptation, as venom, as sorcery. She was no longer remembered as a queen, but as a cautionary tale of the danger of women and the weakness of men who fall into their arms. Across centuries, this distortion only deepened. In medieval Europe, Cleopatra was nearly forgotten, a vague figure appearing only in moralistic tales of sin. By the Renaissance, she reappeared on canvas, but never as a woman of intellect. Artists painted her at the moment of death, skin pale as ivory, chest exposed, lips parted, a serpent in her hand, the very image of fatal seduction. The world did not depict Cleopatra with scrolls, nor portray her in council chambers, nor place her beside maps of strategy. The world remembered only Cleopatra as the woman who died for love and lust. Then came Hollywood, where the image was magnified further. Elizabeth Taylor in the 1963 epic Cleopatra donned hundreds of dazzling gowns, eyes lined dark, walking the palace as a goddess of beauty. The film became iconic, but it cemented the stereotype. Cleopatra as legendary temptress rather than a political mind. All those layers of glittering paint concealed the truth. Cleopatra did not live and die for love. She lived and died for an ideal, to protect Egypt from being devoured, to uphold the dignity of the pharaoh, and to challenge Rome even knowing it was a gamble nearly impossible to win. Today, as modern historians turn the fragile pages of papyrus, as they read texts unfiltered by Roman propaganda, another image of Cleopatra emerges. Not the Eastern witch, but a strategist, a sharp diplomat, a ruler respected by her people. She wielded language as a weapon, economy as a tool, and knew how to use symbols to consolidate her authority. Cleopatra's true legacy lies not in beauty, but in intellect, in her ability to survive in an age when a woman, no matter how brilliant, was targeted by a world ruled by men. And perhaps the distortion itself, the fact that Rome recast her as a depraved woman, is the strongest proof of her true power. For if she had been nothing more than a harmless beauty, Rome would not have needed to slander her for 2,000 years. If she had been merely an Eastern mistress, Augustus would not have feared her enough to rewrite all of history in order to erase her intelligence. Cleopatra remains even today proof that history is not only written by the victors, it is twisted by their fear. And what Rome feared most in Cleopatra was not her beauty but her intellect, the mind of a woman bold enough to challenge the mightiest empire on earth. For more than 2,000 years, the world viewed Cleopatra through the lens Rome created. A seductress, an Eastern witch, the woman who brought Rome's greatest men to their knees. But today that veil is tearing. Historians, archaeologists, and scholars are uncovering the buried fragments, restoring Cleopatra's true image, and what they find astonishes the world. Cleopatra was not merely a beauty. She was a scholar, a stateswoman, a queen who seized her own destiny in a man's world. She was fluent in at least 9 languages: Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, and several Eastern tongues. In a dynasty where Ptolemaic kings had relied on interpreters to address their people, Cleopatra broke tradition and spoke Egyptian directly. That act alone made her the most beloved pharaoh of her line. She was more than a linguist. Cleopatra was a true leader. She reigned during a time of famine, corruption, and Roman pressure, yet maintained relative stability. She reformed Egypt's economy, controlled trade, and turned the Nile's grain into a weapon, gold and silver into diplomatic tools. She was also a military strategist. Cleopatra did not sit idly in palaces. She took part in campaign councils with Antony. Records suggest she commanded fleets, monitored trade routes, and had influence in key military decisions. Cleopatra was no mistress trailing after generals. She was a powerful ally, an equal player in the game of empire. Modern scholars see another layer, Cleopatra as a symbol of female power. In a world where women were dismissed and excluded, Cleopatra dared to sit beside Caesar and Antony, dared to call herself pharaoh, a title almost always reserved for men. She proved that intellect could rival armies, and that resolve could match the mightiest legions. The irony is clear. It was precisely because Cleopatra was too intelligent, too powerful, that she became Rome's obsession. They could not allow such a woman to exist in memory, and so they rewrote history, reducing her to a seductress, erasing her intellect and politics. That distortion lasted for millennia, but truth does not die. The surviving papyri, the coins stamped with her image, the statues, all reveal a queen with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, not a mere muse of passion. Modern research is restoring Cleopatra not as a goddess of love, but as a stateswoman, one of antiquity's most brilliant rulers. Today, Cleopatra is remembered by many scholars as a symbol of endurance. She was not defeated, she was betrayed by history. Rome rewrote her story to kill her intellect. But across centuries, Cleopatra's voice still echoes, in books, in research, in the imagination of those who seek the truth. And the fact that we are still speaking of Cleopatra, more than 2,000 years later, is proof that Rome failed to erase her. She survives not in bones, but in memory. Cleopatra is a reminder. History is not only what is written, but also what is distorted. She proved that women were never mere shadows behind men. They could alter the course of the world. Perhaps Cleopatra died in a silent chamber in Alexandria, perhaps by poison or by serpent's bite, but her legacy never died. For each time humanity seeks to restore truth to a figure distorted by history, Cleopatra rises again, not as a legendary beauty, but as a true queen.